Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on racism, xenophobia, and racial discrimination, organized by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. This webinar will be moderated by Mr. Nicolas Sosa, member of the CCIA Commission. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are right now. Thank you very much, Segma. Just to explain to you how we are going to proceed during this webinar. First of all, this is an initiative organized by Segma's FAO from the CCIA Commission of the World Council of Churches. And we also have the privilege of having the support of Reverend Dr. Odair Pedroso Mateus from the Commission Faith and Order of the World Council of Churches. He's from Brazil, and this is the first webinar of a series of webinars that have been tackling the subject of racism, xenophobia, and racial discrimination. And this is the first time we're going to do it in Spanish. The webinar, as you know, will be focused on racism and xenophobia with a focus on Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And we are going to organize it in the following ways. We will have two separate modules, two thematic modules with 3 speakers each. We have 6 speakers in total. And then we'll have some time for Q&A so we can share some ideas and make comments. Some technical issues. For those of you who are connected, we ask you to please turn off your cameras, except for the speakers, and your microphones, as to avoid any unnecessary background noise. If you have any questions, you can leave them or write them in the chat, but you cannot use your microphones because they will be blocked. This webinar will be recorded in English and then in Spanish, and then it will be available in English as well. Let's begin with the first module. We will have the presentation of Dr. Betty Ruth Lozano. She is Colombian researcher, anti-racist and popular feminist. She's also a sociologist and has a master's degree in philosophy and Latin American and cultural studies. She has been working really hard on subjects affecting women, multiple forms of oppression, neoliberal capitalism, and she has been an activist in defending women against all sorts of violence. She has also been working for several years as a director of research of the Unibautista University of Cali. Betty, you have the floor. You have 7 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and a good day to all of you. Now, the first thing is I will just use the time rapidly to speak about what the Colombians, there are about 50 million of us Colombians. Now, out of these 50 million, there are about 25% who form the black or population or people of African descent. Now, the official figures don't really reflect reality. The black and Afro-Colombian population amounts to almost 2 million people. The black population is more or less anonymous. Afro-Colombians, people of African descent, palenqueros, and other members of black communities, we were brought here in captivity to do all of these different jobs, these different kinds of work. This was in some of the large properties, the haciendas, but also in the form of domestic work, housework. The struggle of this population, this enslaved population, began very rapidly. These people were seeking liberty. They were, for instance, located mainly in the Colombian Pacific region, and the majority of the black population was involved. Also, they build sui generis campesino communities, and these were meant to be an alternative to the developed world, to the predatory capitalist world. And they have a very specific role, and they have respect for the life of all. Unfortunately, however, starting in the 1980s, the development policies really impacted this entire region, and this then led to forced displacement of some of these populations. This was part of the hegemonic development. A lot of these people then migrated to the cities. This happened in the 1980s and 1990s. At the end of the 90s and in the 2000s, there was also armed conflict that was playing out in these territories. This then led to genocide and other acts impacting the black population, and to this day, most of these cities are located in, a lot of these people are now represented in urban areas. The population of African descent lived in Colombia, lived throughout this war in a very specific way. This population was oppressed. I think that everyone requires the events that happened with the FARC and the paramilitaries and the gas pipeline that was in the middle of this conflict. This was there were institutional massacres, one could almost call them, and this affected a great majority of the black population. There was a very strong impact caused by the armed conflict, and this was throughout these territories. This led to a great many victims and to acts of violence against women. And here we're speaking of conflict, but we can also speak about a development policy which severely impacted these black populations. There were very big projects, capitalistic projects, and there were many incidents of violence against women, and that has to be seen as part of a continuum of violence against women. These were very barbaric acts, and this really severely impacted women, as I was saying, and this led to genocide of some of these indigenous peoples. And then what happened in the cities, there were different forms of violence. Colombia is a country where ideology, the message propagated by the nationalists, has a strong racist dimension. The people familiar with this call it racism because we're all mixed, we're all mestizos, and there is really this ideology and this racist ideology, and it really ignores the color of the skin. And for the African population of African descent, this limits their possibilities in terms of living conditions and has a huge impact on their lives. So being black in Colombia is really a problem. The young people are harassed by the police, and some of them are murdered as well. So here, what we're talking about is a Colombia that has never left the colonial era behind. It has never got past this time where the whites really had all the privileges and the blacks were forced to be subject to them. Now, what I wanted to say was, with regard to feminicide, there have been a great many women who have been killed, and a great many black women have been killed. Even in the cities, they're on the peripheral areas. They live on the outskirts of the city, for instance, in this town of Cali, and many of them have been murdered. And sometimes these women have 3 or 4 sons, and these 3 or 4 children have all been killed. So this is what some of the black population are subject to, and also a lot of these black women have been killed. Now, among the quality of life indicators within the places where the black population is located, we can see that if we're talking about employment, for example, the color of the skin really matters quite a bit. For black people in Colombia, they have high unemployment levels, and this, of course, affects women as well. Now, here we're talking about the situation of poor black people, where the color of the skin really is a decisive factor on their lives. And there is this real Afrophobia, and they are at real risk of being killed, of being murdered in Colombia. And so I really think that we can leave things here, and perhaps I can come back into the conversation later on.
Excellent, Betty. Thank you very much. We can see that more people are joining our webinar, so we welcome you all. And let me remind you that we are asking you to connect your webcam so we can also see you. If you don't want to connect it, that would also help the speed of our connection. You can leave your questions down in our chat. So we will continue now to the next presentation of Beneco. Beneco Enesia. He's the director of CEDESO, which is the Center for Sustainable Development, and coordinator of Dominicans for Rights, a platform that accompanies and claims the rights to Dominican nationality of stateless persons in the Dominican Republic. He comes from the province of Independencia, and he graduated from the Autonomous University of Santo Domingo. He has been working on human rights issues and social insertion of the migrant population and families. He has done great work in political advocacy as well. Beneco, you have the floor. You have 7 minutes. Beneco, can you hear us? We can't hear you very well. Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the World Council of Churches for this opportunity to have this exchange and to discuss all these issues in the Dominican Republic. The Caribbean region is suffering from several of these issues. Beneco, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have some technical issues and we cannot hear you very clearly. If you could turn off your camera, maybe we can get a better sound. Beneco, Segma will give you a call. We're having some technical issues. Can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you. Segma is calling you right now. Beneco, Segma is calling you right now. Please pick up the phone. Beneco? Now we can hear you. As I was saying, just to give you some context, the Dominican Republic, as many countries in the Caribbean, we are a country of Afro-descendants. However, the survey from 2017 of the Institute for Social Investigation asked Dominican citizens about what would they choose if they could choose the color of their skin. Most of them, 46%, who were Indians of Indian descent, nine percent were mestizos. And when they define themselves as Indians, we need to remember that this reflects on their identity, the identity of racism, because an Indian is supposed to hide its negritude, its blackness. And that is the identity in the Dominican Republic. A DNA test carried out in the Dominican Republic showed a very alarming result, and that created an explosion in the national public opinion, determining that 49% of the Dominican citizens is African. It's of African descent. So less than a decade ago, our IDs would define us as Indians. And even though less than a decade ago this was supposed to be changed, and we were not being named as mulatto, mestizo, etc., they decided to eliminate this profile, this definition, because in conclusion, we did not want to accept that we were black. And yes, I say black because for us Dominicans, black is the other. It's the foreigner. It's the Indian. Our social inheritance does not allow us to accept ourselves as black. We want to believe that we are the white man, the white woman who is valued. Because being white is synonym of beauty, intelligence, etc. That's why our children, our girls, our women are forced to change the color of their hair, for example. The other tendency is to get married to a white person. If you marry a white person, you will improve the race. Just looking at what happened in our country with the election of beauty queens in our country. We have several beauty pageants. And in these beauty pageants, there was a high levels of intolerance against candidates or beauty queens who were Afro-descendant. They were not accepted. They were discriminated against. Of course, this is not by chance. We need to understand that this is part of our culture. This is part of our social structure. And I don't want to say that the educational system is not responsible for this behavior, but it's part of our culture. It's our expression, our cultural expression. This phenomenon of discrimination, of structural discrimination, has always been with us in the Dominican Republic. Girls, for example, are taught to straighten their hair because the Afro hair is not straight. So all of these sorts of expressions of what's beautiful and what's not beautiful. Straight hair is beautiful. Curly hair is not beautiful. Black hair is not beautiful. So all of these traits make people feel discriminated against. So this education creates an environment of discrimination. And we deny these Afro-descendant traits. And we try to give more importance to being white. In my country, we live in a self-discriminatory environment. There are several groups that are being discriminated against, but they also discriminate others. And this is part of our history of slavery. And the response to this discrimination, these types of discriminations, is always to deny it, to say that we're not a discriminatory society. However, we do reject people of color, and we have been trying to pass a law against these forms of discrimination. Another important fact that reveals this discrimination is deportation and migration control. This is also based on discriminatory practices. We discriminate against the poor, the Indians, the Afro-descendants. And this becomes an odyssey. There's huge migration flows that come to the country where people are chosen or discriminated against based on the color of their skin. They ask sometimes for their passports and an ID card. And there is a prevalence of this sort of discrimination. Between 110 and 145,000 people who came in a group of undocumented persons were discriminated against at our borders. This has led us to the biggest civil genocide in the Americas in the past century. Over 210,000 people lost their nationality because of their origins in the Dominican Republic, because of the Law 168. This was created because of a leader, an Afro-descendant leader, Peña Gómez, who started a struggle to become the president of the country. Because he had always been discriminated on the basis of his race, this discrimination led to a social crisis. And the loss of nationality for many people. And this was the biggest act of discrimination that is registered in our civil registries. The state reacted, of course, by proposing Law 169/14. This law has not had the expected result, but it has created even more discrimination. The Constitutional Tribunal declared so many people as non-Dominicans, and so they fell into a stateless category. This created divisions among people, different groups, Group A, Group B, and within this A group, you have subcategories, and all because of this system of discrimination in the city hall and our civil registries. And that can have huge consequences in the future. Those people who belong to Group A or Group B who never had an identity documents are also subdivided. And that gave birth to other groups. And all these groups have been segregated and have not been recognized by the state of the Dominican Republic in order to control them. Another important group, also a victim, Beneco. Beneco, I'm sorry. We are running out of time for your presentation, even though it's been very interesting. We would like to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this law during the plenary, during the Q&A session, if you don't mind, so we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Excelente. Muchas gracias, Beneco. Vamos a volver entonces sobre este tema en breve.
Thank you, Beneco. Now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Reverend Johanna Dark. She is a pastor of the Methodist Church of Brazil. She is the executive secretary of Life and Mission in the national area. She works with social action and in several projects that the Methodist Church carries out in different regions of the Brazilian territory. She's responsible for monitoring and sending missionaries outside and within the Brazilian territory. She's the president of Diaconia, a nonprofit Brazilian Christian social organization that aims to promote justice and social development. Johanna, Reverend Johanna, you have the floor.
Gracias. Buenos días o buenas tardes.
Thank you. I would like to give you some context before my presentation. Last week, the Vice President of Brazil said that the country has a cultural patrimony that comes from indigenous and black communities. He said the black peoples are vagabonds, they're stupid, they're lazy. This very strong statement from the Vice President are going to feed racism, and they create great concern among the population and the future of the Constitution of Brazil. This Vice President also stated that his grandson was very handsome because his skin was whiter and he was undergoing skin whitening. He said this as a joke, but we take it very seriously. We are having some technical issues.
Sí, perdón, estamos teniendo algunos problemas de
We
audio.
cannot hear you very well, Johanna. There is the background noise and we can't hear you very clearly. I invite all of you who are not speaking at the moment to please turn off your microphones and we'll try again.
Oi? Sim?
Sí, continúa, Johanna, a ver si
Johanna,
mejora el audio.
continue.
Está mejor?
Can you hear me better now?
Bueno. ¿Sí? ¿Ok?
Sí, sí, sí.
Bueno, no hay duda que el tema de
There's no
racismo
doubt that
en
racism
Brasil
in Brazil
sempre contemporâneo.
is a contemporary matter, it's a
Claramente,
current
depois de mais de 100 años,
situation that continues to
depois de
affect
100
our
años,
society.
fim da escola de
Even
ensino no
after
país,
slavery ended,
o prejuízo
we still
racial
suffer
é uma
from
realidade cotidiana da
discrimination
sociedade brasileira.
in Brazilian
A
society.
lei que otorgava a liberdade
The law
legal de los
that gave
escravizados
freedom to the
na
slaves
realidade nunca
in
se
reality was never
integraram
integrated
na
in the
economia
economy.
e
They were
com a
never
ajuda do
integrated in
Estado.
the
Muitas
national
pessoas
economy
negras
without the help of the
caíram
state.
em
Many
dificuldades
people
no
of
pescoço
color, Afro-descendants, were
de
poor,
se chamada libertar.
were left behind.
Portanto, há 630 anos não há havido nenhuma referência legal
After
a nenhuma
63
restrição de
years
raça.
of this law, we haven't seen any changes.
Para o racismo em Brasil,
Another way to hide racism in Brazil was the ideology of whitening,
e das correntes científicas com a corrente de
with these new trends
darwinismo
of
racial e eugenismo, muito bem
racial
estrategicamente elaborada.
discrimination that were very well elaborated.
Essa
And
ideologia facilitou a entrada de
eugenics
imigrantes europeus e árabes em terras brasileiras.
has only gotten worse.
Visto como el branqueamento de la
So the
población
whitening of the population is very anchored in the society in Brazil from the beginning of the 20th century because black people
abandonando sua cultura
were abandoning their culture, their African culture, and trying to
pelas vítimas do
adopt
racismo, seu próprio perdão,
white behaviors.
dando forma de las mentes para o branqueamento ideal.
In practice, many black people prefer to marry people with lighter skin so that their children would have less probabilities to be discriminated against. However, over the decades and after many decades of economic growth, we still see social discrimination. The Brazilian government accepts that we are a racist country. Many laws have been elaborated, but structural racism is very strong, it's institutionalized in Brazil. And our current context in Brazil shows that we have many different forms of social inequality. There's a prevalence of violence among different groups. And many studies carried out in our country show that 75% of victims of homicide in Brazil in 2017 were people of color. In the educational system, racism is a very present problem. black teenagers and children, black children, they spend about 9 years of their lives facing racism and its consequences in primary school, as well as during their entire education school years. Among the youth, the Afro-descendant youth, access to education is very difficult. There's a very low political representation. They don't have full participation in the educational system. And at many levels, the youth is discriminated against. Although we do have many activist groups who are working against this form of discrimination. The youth have started to claim their rights, their cultural identity, their religious identity, their moral identity. They have been creating a sense of belonging. And we've seen many groups, many activist groups working to combat discrimination. These activist groups are mostly seen in the favelas or minority groups in our country. Education has a decisive role to fight against these expressions of violence and discrimination. And we cannot forget that these minority groups also have human rights, the right to education, the right to decent housing, etc. But the black population is not very well represented. And it goes beyond these activists. They are ready to confront those who discriminate against them, and they are using several platforms such as social media, etc. Racism is shameless. When a football player in Brazil is beaten up, or when a young journalist is insulted in the social media, everybody knows about it. Thanks to the social media. But if that were to happen to a black person, we wouldn't know about it. We would just say it was a joke, and we wouldn't take it seriously. It's only when it happens to white people that we take it seriously. We have a lot of work to do in this respect in my country, and I would like to see a continuous work in this respect. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers. Now we are about to finish the first of the two modules. We have a few minutes for comments or any questions that were left. I am thinking about Beneco because he was about to tell us something interesting before we had a technical issue. We have about 5 minutes if you want to make a comment before we move on to the second module.
Yes, Beneco, go ahead. So can you hear me? Yes, is the answer. Now, the last case concerning these groups, this is an expression of discrimination as well. I can hardly... These were immigrant sons and people. They had limits on what they could do, because if their children are registered, then it makes it difficult for them to acquire the nationality of their parents afterwards, and to pass on their nationality, the nationality of the parents. So they find themselves in a situation of being undocumented. And here, the statistics talk about 40,000 children who are in such a situation, without speaking of specific discrimination targeting such victims, because in a great many countries you'd have mixed couples. This is the expression that's used. And then in other places they're called striped, more or less. They're a specific word. And this has an impact, of course, on these Dominican Republic citizens, and this can lead to situations of vulnerability. Thank you very much, says the moderator. Now, we've listened to the first series of presentations, and there's one common thread running throughout this, and this is the structural racism, but also the invisibility of these minorities. And one of the questions that comes to mind in this respect, perhaps you could weigh in on each of these cases in terms of political representation. How does this play out? If there is a certain amount of political representation of people of African descent or of blacks, or does this invisibility lead to a situation where there is no political representation as elected officials? How does this really play out in reality? Well, I'll answer. I'll start. Speaking of the example of Colombia, yes, there is this structural racism on all levels and in all social and political fields. That is a fact of life. There is no real representation of the black population that is proportionate to the proportionate of the population that they represent. However, people, blacks who come to, who occupy high-level political posts are not really traditional, and they do not really reflect the interest of the majority of the black population. So I think that here, in political representation would be a way out within this colonial state. So I don't really think that this could change a whole lot from the perspective of inclusion or participation in all fields. I think we need a much far-reaching change so that we can combat the racist structures, colonial structures, so that we can really have black figures in politics. Thank you very much, says the moderator. I don't know if you have anything else to share. The others, any comments? I would just like to add one point, and that is in the case of people who are populations that are a majority black, that this means that our behavior is not what it's expected to be, and this reproduces this extreme scenario, and this really shouldn't be the case. Thank you very much, says the moderator. It's the same thing in Brazil. It's the same situation in Brazil as in Colombia. The political parties are not representative. There is a quota for the participation of women, but there's no quota for the participation of blacks, indigenous people, people of African descent, as here in Brazil. Thank you very much, says the moderator. Thank you. Now, if you agree, why we've finished the first module, and we'll then move on to the next module with 3 additional keynote speakers. They will have different points of views, and why don't we start with a perspective that will be brought to us, the Indigenous Perspective by Reverend Jor-El, Dalia Eunice Juarez Fernandez. She comes from the Mexican Nahuatl indigenous culture. She was the first indigenous woman in Mexico to be ordained. She holds a master's degree in Latino ministries. She currently acts as general coordinator of the Mayan Intercultural Seminar in Chiapas, Mexico. And in addition to her administrative responsibilities, which I've mentioned, she has a passion for teaching, for example, in the field of Bible studies, pastoral counseling, interculturality, and work with different communities affected by these topics that we're taking up. So then why don't we start with her viewpoint, and now we will be listening to what she has to say. Thank you very much for the presentation, but I think that I have connection problems. It'll take me a minute to get plugged in here. Okay, the moderator says we'll wait until our speaker can solve this technical issue with the... So I would just like to remind you at this stage that this webinar is the first in a series of thematic webinars, and we have people that have been connected. They've come online and they're now listening to us, and we have a series of keynote speakers, brief presentations that we'll be hearing, and then you'll be free to ask questions and comment. And if all of you are connected, then please, those who aren't speaking, turn your webcam off, so avoid any interference or sound. Now, Dalia, if you're ready now. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak on the topics of discrimination, specifically the racism, the targeting in the indigenous people of Latin America. I think that the first 3 topics that we're talking about, xenophobia, racial discrimination, and racism, these 3 topics are related. Now, for example, the indigenous peoples, there is also the dimension of violence. In our indigenous Mayan communities, we can really see this dimension of violence. And in the context of terror and violence that various Latin American peoples are experiencing, this makes me think that the economic model specifically was not really created to benefit the indigenous peoples or vulnerable groups. So this was established for an elite of whites who based themselves on a neoliberal capitalistic system. So the system that is imposed has led us into a situation, and we, even though we're trying to resist the impact, this has a very severe impact on us. So, for more than 25 years, there was the Convention 169 of ILO on indigenous and tribal peoples, emphasizing the rights that these people have as indigenous peoples. Notwithstanding, these rights are very frequently flouted. And my question is, why then are we talking about human rights? Humanity is trying to really cover this up, and they're coming up with laws trying to deal with this, treaties, conventions, and other instruments. But the problem is these are really not applied. And alarmingly, these are our own our own governments are engaging in discrimination. This neoliberal capitalist system is building borders, is building walls, and these are then guarded by various peoples. And because of this, there is a need to cross the walls of xenophobia, racial discrimination, so that we can discover that we live in an oppressive system. And this is often based on the physical appearance of people, their ethnic background, their sexuality, this discrimination. And we really have to find ways to act in this respect. In Mexico, when the president spoke with different people, and there was a democratically elected president. However, what we're seeing is that the system is more or less the same as it's been in the past. People are being taken out of their territories. They're being evicted. Their rivers, their mountains, their beaches, all of this are being taken away from them. These have been privatized, and these are used for pipeline projects, various large-scale projects, road building, and also the introduction of OGMs. And here we have been experiencing this for more than 5 centuries. These different forms of violence, and a great many times we see this as invasions. And here there has been a growing militarization and criminalization that is infecting us. And Manuela Obrador, and we can see this in other Latin American presidents. So these major companies have a great amount of recognition, and there are then the indigenous peoples suffer. They try to defend their land and their territory, and they are subject to violence as they do so. And because of this, we indigenous people are trying to get organized. We're trying to gain recognition. So we are trying to come up with ways of trying to find the key to emancipation for all indigenous peoples, but also for all those who are placed in the category of vulnerable groups. It's important to help build a different new world where we can think we can't do this on our own. We really need to get together, to join forces so that we can map out our own path. In the midst of chaos, there is really a return to state terror against immigrants, and an economy where we are simply trying to survive. We really have to recognize this spirit. We have to deal with these new realities. We have to work together so that we can achieve this goal. I don't know.
Yes, I guess you got disconnected, but we can still hear you. So I think that different forms of violence suffered by indigenous peoples and all the other vulnerable groups are due to the government system They want to end these groups because they want to have a white supremacy. Even women are being targeted. Women are changing the color of their hair so they can blend in a country that discriminates against minorities. We are not recognized as Indigenous women in our own country. Our own country is stealing from us, taking away all of our natural resources, resources that are vital for the survival of several communities. And I will try to finish my presentation now because I'm having connection problems. Thank you so much, Dalia. I think you're running out of time for your presentation, but if you have anything else to say, we could give you some more time at the end in the Q&A session. What do you think?
Ahí está, perfecto. Bien, entonces, si les parece, seguimos con la...
Let's move on to our next speaker. Now, we will present Reverend Jor-El Ortega do Pico. He is the president of the Cuban Council of Churches. He will be sharing his experience in Cuba. He is the president of the Cuban Council of Churches, as I said. He is a pastor at the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba, in Varadero, Cuba. He's a member of the General Council of the Synod, IPRC. He is president also of Acanacom, and he worked with the World Communion of Reformed Churches. He's the vice president of the Cuban Council of Churches, and he is currently a member of the Executive Committee of ACT Alliance. For those of you who know him, you might remember that he has participated in several instances, such as this one. We give you the floor, Reverend Jor-El Ortega do Pico.
Yes, hello. Yes, I can hear you fine. Sorry, I'll just have to ask you for a bit of patience because also in the struggle between the USA and Cuba, there's also the embargo. This has an impact on us as well. So this also affects our capacity in various areas. So first of all, I'd just like to point out very briefly this. In Cuba, we have to talk about prior to the Cuban Revolution, and also there have always been migratory flows between Cuba and the US, for example, and we should really note that the church, to take an example, in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the churches, the North American churches sent missionaries to Cuba, and these were usually Protestant missionaries who were sent to Cuba, and the majority of these missionaries came from the South, the deep South of the United States, so of course they were white. And so they had musical instruments such as the organ to play sacred music on, and also guitar was our Cuban that was part of our Cuban identity, but these were instruments of the devil, the guitar and other instruments. So these were tools for racial discrimination at the time. And in a great many denominations, the idea of confronting some of these religious practices, this came to mind. So in terms of worship within the church experience, and back the president, Cuban president, this was the dictator Batista, he himself was a mulatto, and he couldn't participate fully in some of these events in Havana organized by white people. So it was very clear that racial discrimination was very pervasive in the country. Now, in this first half of the 20th century, in Cuba, you had major American companies that set up in the country, and they implemented a form of racism that dated back to the Spanish colonial experience. And there was a black general in the army, and he, both along with his family, Antonio Maceo, they played a role in the struggle. And then after this, we're talking about after the first half of the 20th century, and there was clear discrimination against the blacks. And then 1959, there was the social revolution, and the primary goal was equality and freedom and empowering black people. But even with all of the laws and all of the efforts made, this is a very complex subject, racism, and it's very deeply rooted. So despite all of the efforts that were made, it still exists. And the point should also be made, if we talk about these communities, we do see changes in Cuba. We're talking about there still is racism in Cuba. It exists. And we can also see the funding. We talk about white dollars, the money flowing in, and there was a great amount of high volume of migration in the 1960s, and these were a lot of the upper classes, the whites, and these people left Cuba, and a lot of the children left as well. And they had family members elsewhere. So a lot of the Cuban exiles settled in Miami. They were predominantly white, of course. And this really, you could see this clear racist dimension here. And here, even when Cuba, compared with a great many other places, seems to offer greater opportunities in terms of law, in terms of the state policies, there is still greater participation and visibility for blacks at different levels. The vice president of the state was black, but on other levels, this continues to pose a challenge, the challenge of racism in our country. And we really have to mobilize civil society as well. The church has accompanied these changes, but we really have to look at these topics in perspective. And there is a mixture between the culture, the different culture. There is the migration issue, and there is the racism dimension, and the idea of striking a balance between socialism and sustainable development. But we also there is also the consumer dimension, the different practices developed within the communities. I think that we don't have a lot of time left, but we are here on our continent, and we look at the rest of the world, we see major challenges, especially with regard to growth of fundamentalism, and there are links between, for example, the United States and church circles, and this is not really facilitating good understanding, a good solution, a resolution to our conflict. Thank you very much. I hope I was happy to weigh in from Cuba and give you the benefit of my thoughts. Excellent, says the moderator. We heard you very well. Thank you very much for your thoughts, for your perspective. And there are a great many other things that I could say, but I didn't have much more time to put things in perspective. Perfect, says the moderator. And now, as I said, we are going to have a time for Q&A and comments afterwards on some of these very issues. Now, if you agree, why don't we move on to the last keynote speaker in the webinar. And here, this is Gabriela Ligari. She's speaking to us from Argentina. She's Executive Director of the Argentine Commission for Refugees and Migrants. She has a B in social work from the University of Buenos Aires and has specialized in planning and management of social policies and has studied at master level in social policies from the same university. She's a professor in the social work career of the Faculty of Social Sciences of the UBA and the National University of Lanús. She's in charge of human rights and asylum, specializing in human rights, migration, and asylum from the Center of Human Rights and Justice of the National UNLA. Gabriela, thank you very much for being here with us, and we're looking. I'll give you the floor so that you can say what you have to say to us. Hello. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Can you hear me fine? Yes, fine. So, first of all, I would just like to express my thanks to SEGMA and to the World Council of Churches for this kind invitation to participate in this webinar and to share the experience of Argentina with you. Just some of the previous keynote speakers made me think of the importance of some of these spaces, some of these forums, to be able to analyze together some of these phenomena, the historical perspective within our region. Many speakers talked about the interest within our nations of trying to be whiter, of the whitening of the population, and the historical perspective. Now, Argentina is not an exception, as you are well aware. The original peoples, the indigenous peoples of Argentina, were massacred in 2 different campaigns. And because of this, there are very few indigenous people still living, the original indigenous people. In 1933 and 35 and 1833, there were 2 campaigns. And this really, we can speak of genocide, to appropriate the lands held by these original indigenous peoples. And this started in 1813 with the abolition of slavery, and this was the first constitution that the country had. Now, the Afro-Argentine population was very invisible at the time, and there were internal wars, and they were really on the front lines within these wars, and they were often sacrificed. There was a very high mortality rate among them in these conflicts. Now, today, some of them, historically, they were really became invisible, we could say. So there was a real struggle to ensure their visibility, to enhance their visibility, to ensure their rights, that they can claim their rights within our societies. Now, with regard to was something that I wanted to mention, the racism, how it's linked to migration. Now, within the time limits, I would like to focus on three major topics. First of all, I would like to give you some comments based on the Argentine experience of how we can assert that the state and state government officials play a very key role when it comes to promoting or restricting racist practices and xenophobic discourses within our communities. To give you some examples, in the case of Argentina, and this is maybe not recent, back in the 90s, there were the neoliberal policies implemented. There was this led, of course, to widespread employment, a rise in insecurity. These policies were linked to social areas such as education as well. Now, at this time, the migrant population was this was really on the agenda of the state government officials, but also the trade unions. And they were blaming the migrant populations for all of the evils of the society, all of the problems. This was fallacious, of course. They were blamed for the unemployment, and they were also blamed for the rise in insecurity. This, of course, led to some grave cases of violence, leading to the death of persons in some cases. There were various cases that could be cited. Then, in the 2000s, a new phase began. This was linked to regional integration. Here, this was also tied into human rights and a certain centralization. With regard to migratory issues, there was a migratory law in 2004 which amended the previous legislation. Now, in the 2004 law, immigration was conceived as a human right, and the state was then bound to guarantee this in conditions of equality for all. Okay, I can't go into all the details because it would take too much time, but this was a real landmark to see a real turnaround with regard to the whole issue of migration. And the state itself and the state officials started to really put forward the idea of a bigger Latin America. Here, the Latin American migrants had the opportunity of having, for instance, accessing self-care, of accessing education, even university education, which had never been the case before. Now, this didn't cause any detriment to the society as a whole. Now, all of these arguments were then linked to this had to be seen in the context where the migrants were competing with nationals for jobs. They posed a threat to citizens. Now, this social phenomenon during this time played a very important role for all of these communities, not only for migrants, but also for all of the others within society. You could see this as a non-equal community because there were different classes, but this was a community that lived on the same territory. They coexisted together. Now, in 2015, there was a rightist government which there were elections and the opposition won. So then we had a different government in December. So this has really caused a great many of us to react. We feel this very strongly. In 2015, the Macri government started to introduce xenophobic discourse related to the crime rates and migration. And here, then, this led to new standards because there was a decree of 2017, an executive decree, facilitating the deportation of any migrants for any events linked to any kind of a criminal background. So this was a criminalization of migration, and also the state's own role in this. We started to hear a certain discourse that Argentina was really getting this dregs, the scum from Peru, from other countries, and there were arguments like the problem, equality was a problem in Argentina. All of this was in the mouths of senators, the opposition, or the vice presidential, Macri's vice presidential candidate. Now, I see I only have a couple of minutes left. Okay. Now, the second topic that I would like to go into and give you a couple of ideas within this very short time frame is that racism in Argentina is very subtle. It's a bit hidden, but it is combined with other mechanisms of exclusion, for example, like a cultural fundamentalism. So people seeing culture as opposed to other different kinds of culture, and racism as a cultural fundamentalism combined with migration leads then to restrictions on the exercise of rights. Citizenship restrictions, I would even go so far as to say. Now, these restrictions generate on a daily basis different forms of exclusion, segregation, which we can see as affecting different groups, historically the Bolivians, but also the Senegalese inhabitants who are the subject of real violations of their rights, especially in terms of safety, and women of African descent in particular, Dominican or Haitian women. There are also other aspects, and here we can see the intersectionality, the cross-cutting nature. When we speak of racism, we're not only talking about things linked to race, but also topics linked to social class, linked to gender, linked to diversity as well. And these differences in terms of identity, the different groups, then also exacerbate situations of vulnerability, not only with regard to the security forces, but they are often excluded from public spaces, from health and education. In the case of Dominican women, it's not just the fact that they're Dominican and that they're foreigners, but they're blacks, they're poor, they're women, and in a great many cases, they are then fired from their jobs or reduced to work in the sex industry. Now, here, in all of what I've said, to sum up, I think it's very important to really give thought to our own practices as a church, as ecumenical organizations, when we try to think of how we can intervene within these frameworks. Today, I don't have time to talk about the situation of the Venezuelan population, but I think this is a very clear example that shows how within these major groups, this generates situations of xenophobia, discrimination in a great many cases, and this, of course, is fueled by our very own states. This poses some real challenges in terms of social ties. We have to strengthen these social ties, the ties of solidarity, and it's also very important that we don't generate inequalities between the different groups. Today, within the different regions, there are a great many actions, there are different funds trying to benefit the Venezuelan groups. Now, that's fine, But the problem is when these very actions are not really on an equitable basis for other immigrant groups in similar situations of vulnerability. So the moderator is saying, I'm just interrupting you because we have about 10 minutes to have a plenary, but I just wanted to put a question to you. And if you would like to comment on this, my question here is, you mentioned that in Argentina there are different standards affecting migrants and so on, immigrants, but there are differences between different migratory groups. For example, it's perhaps not the same to take in a migrant from Bolivia, Venezuela, Africa, or Europe. There are differences. I don't know if you would like to comment on this issue of how these different groups are received. Yes, I share your comments. And with regard to the question that you asked, I get the feeling that you can analyze this on different levels, but how society takes in different groups of migrants, how they react. Well, in the final analysis, historically, society has really said the basis of civilization is linked to being white and European. This is an identity framework that our society has always supported. If you're a migrant, you're white, you're European, you will always be better received and taken in by society than a poor immigrant who's black and from the region. All right. Now, I think that there's another aspect as well that should be noted. There are different categories of migrants. And when you talk about differences due to class, for example, what we see is that sometimes it doesn't have to do with the color of skin or not. It's more whether they're poor or not. The rejection of poverty is a real substantive issue that we're seeing here. Now, also, there are legal and normative issues in our countries. Within Mercosur, we have migratory, but also Dominican Republic, Haiti, Senegal, and other countries, other African countries. When they're involved, there are a great many difficulties to get documentation. There are different aspects of migration that really with the migrant population.
We only have a few minutes left. We would like to give the opportunity to the other speakers if you have a question or a comment on this particular subject that Gabriela mentioned regarding the question made by Juan, our participant. I open the floor for you. Yeah, just a brief comment. Cuban migrants were privileged when going to the United States. They were privileged because there was a law that ended with the Obama administration that stated that if you were Cuban and you arrived to the United States swimming, this type of migration will be politicized. And the way Cubans were welcomed in the U.S. was different from the welcome that they gave to any other citizen arriving to the United States. There was a law that stimulated a very insecure form of migration, but they gave you a different status as a migrant if you were Cuban. So those states who have the power, they try to stimulate this sort of laws, this type of migrations, creating categories within within these social groups. Sometimes certain sectors are privileged within a political sector or an economic sector. But the human beings are the ones who suffer the consequences of these several forms of discrimination. Thank you very much, Jor-El. I don't know if anyone else would like to comment.
Muchas gracias, Joel. No sé si algún
Yes.
otro comentario de parte del panel.
Yes, Dalia, and then Beneco.
Sí, comenzamos por Dalia y creo que después.
Yes, I would like to say that there are several types of migrants. That is true. And this also happens within the indigenous peoples, migrants. We have internal migrants, internal people who are internally displaced. So they remain in the country and they still suffer from several forms of discrimination. I live in Chiapas and we are neighbors with Guatemala. When we receive a migrant wave from Central America to Chiapas, as indigenous people, we feel really enraged to see our government being manipulated by the countries of the north. We hate to see how our government is closing the borders of our country. Because on the one hand, they're saying we have to support indigenous peoples, but they are closing the borders to those who want to migrate to our territory. So this is a pressing issue, and we need to shed some light on it through our churches, our different spaces, our places of work, etc. Because we all have the right to migrate. We're all citizens of a planet in which we should all have the freedom to move and migrate. And we should avoid racism and xenophobia. Thank you, Dalia. I think Beneco had another comment. Beneco, you have the floor. I think it's very important.
Sí, es importante el señalamiento del derecho que tenemos a migrar.
To talk about our right to migrate. And to say that in the Dominican Republic we had some encouragement to migration from Haiti and other countries. So the Dominican Republic needed labor force from Haiti. But all those workers that came from Haiti did not have basic human rights. And finally, I would like to mention the duality that we have in our country, because we always invest in tourism because that represents a very important source of income for our country. But the basis of discrimination is very evident when we talk about white people being considered the tourists, and the rest, the black people, are the citizens of our country. Well, unfortunately, we have to close this webinar, and I would like to thank all the speakers, Johanna, Beneco, Dalia, Gabriela, Betty, and Jor-El, who took the time to share with us their perspectives from their countries. Thank you very much to all of you who we're connected. And I'd like to remind you that we will upload this online so you can listen to it later on. Thank you very much to SEGMA for organizing this webinar. And thank you to Odair Pedroso for his very valuable contributions to this webinar. Thank you very much. And I invite you all to be connected to the social media of the World Council of Churches so you can receive more news on the next webinars. Thank you very much. Nicolas, SEGMA is asking me to thank you very much for moderating this event, this webinar, and the recorded version will be available very soon, also in English. The next webinar will be on Monday, the 4th of November, on the European context. Thank you. Perfect. So jot it down, 4th of November, the next webinar of this series. So try to share this webinar in Spanish and English for those who could not be connected live. So we're closing now. Greetings from us, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.